Well, thanks everybody for joining. My name's Chris Wade. I'm the CTO with Itential, and today we're super happy to have Scott Raynovich here to help us talk about shift left movement and what it means for networking. Scott, maybe we can start off with a little bit of introduction of Futuriom and some of your research.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So Futuriom was founded about 6 years ago, and we are a boutique technology research firm exclusively focused on cloud and communications infrastructure. So we follow the most interesting trends in cloud infrastructure, and we gather this information from talks with practitioners and surveys, and then talks with technology experts like yourself. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. So the agenda for today, we're going to start off talking a bit about hybrid cloud infrastructure and its adoption in the marketplace. The purpose of the discussion is really to talk about how we're moving from a NetOps mindset to a net DevOps mindset. So we're going to get a bit into what that means for practitioners and ultimately what the shift left movement means for networking. This really manifests itself as an infrastructure as code mindset. So we're going to talk a bit about infrastructure as code as an operational model. Scott's going to talk a bit about kind of the cloud operational model, and with net DevOps, how we're merging that into how we operate networks. We'll talk a little bit about the practicality of adopting infrastructure as code. A lot of discussions we have these days as it pertains to automation and orchestration is really how do we get started with infrastructure as code as a mindset for networking. And we'll talk a bit about at the end about how customers are moving forward with this and net DevOps principles in general. So maybe we'll get started, Scott, with some of the research. Some of the different operational models on the networking side and the cloud side are coming together. So maybe you can give some insights into how the market's viewing this.
For sure. Thanks, Chris. So everybody out there must know that things are changing fast in this world, in this technology world. We've really seen a lot of change, I'd say, in the last 5 to 10 years. When the cloud model, came out first from Amazon, and then Azure and Google and Oracle and all the other clouds. And it was really kind of a new and interesting model for everybody because they could deploy these applications and technology a lot faster using the cloud. It was very efficient for public clouds to build and scale this massive infrastructure that anybody could use. But now we're seeing a little bit of a shift here. And I think that shift is being kind of accelerated, if you will, by this. I call it the post-pandemic environment. I mean, I'm sure you read your newspaper and you read about, are there questions about a recession or are things slowing down? We had Microsoft Azure, the Microsoft earnings last night, where they said that the growth in Azure is slowing, and you should expect a slowing growth rate. That doesn't mean it's stopping. It's just the growth rate is slowing. So you see this kind of a little bit of a retrenchment or a slowdown in the public cloud growth. But I think what's happening is more organizations are thinking about hybrid cloud. And you can see we've gathered some data that's out there from a few surveys, including this Altura survey, where 2 out of 3 professionals see hybrid cloud as the permanent destination for infrastructure. In a Cisco survey that said 82% of IT leaders are adopting hybrid cloud. And then another survey from G2 and Dell that 58% of businesses are anticipated to use hybrid or private cloud. So you might ask, what's driving this? Well, part of it is a big trend that Futuriom is forecasting. We put it in our new Futuriom 50 report that Itential is a proud member of, the Futuriom 50 Club. One of the trends that we see is kind of cost management, cost optimization of cloud solutions, and particularly multi-cloud. And one of the benefits of hybrid cloud is that if you have private infrastructure, you can possibly, cost optimize to use your own hardware in places because people are pointing out that public cloud costs can escalate rapidly. And we've actually done some research and shows like the profit margins on the public clouds like Amazon and Azure are kind of off the charts, above 60%. So they're making a lot of money, but there's this kind of head scratching going on, and CIO and CTO offices saying, well, do we need to spend this much money in public cloud? Can we use more of our own infrastructure? So I would expect that going forward, you're going to see a lot more talk and interest in hybrid cloud solutions. And that's going to lead us into, what Chris is going to talk about in a little bit about, NetOps and Net DevOps, and why that hybrid cloud picture, will drive that. So this is a survey we did last year on multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, specifically networking. And when we asked these, and this was screened for practitioners, I think the sample size was about 102. We asked if they had plans for hybrid deployment or migrating on-prem workloads, and 66% said they were targeting hybrid deployment, which I thought was very interesting. That was a higher number than I expected, when only 26% said they were targeting primarily public cloud. So in the industry, some people call this repatriation, bringing some of the resources back into private infrastructure, or using existing infrastructure that you have to work, in a complementary way to public cloud infrastructure, especially in networking. If you think about all of the infrastructure that's out there that's built by the cloud providers, and not only the cloud providers, but the colo facilities and some of the the cloud specialists like Cloudflare. There's a lot of infrastructure that you can borrow or leverage, but you also want to integrate your own infrastructure with that. So that's kind of what this movement is all about. And you can see on the right, we have been following approximately 20 large scale hybrid operations from the likes of Fidelity and BMW, and they are talking more about hybrid cloud and how to scale across any type of cloud, private, public, hybrid. So that's kind of setting the stage for what Chris is going to lead us into here. So Chris, why don't you take it away and talk about it, what this means for network operations or NetOps, and how do we get this thing that we're calling Net DevOps?
Perfect. Maybe a question first, because it seemed like for a long time there was a one-way road from data center to the cloud, and the operating model was basically we moved an application out. Do you have any ideas on like is the hybrid deployment mostly being driven from the cost optimization perspective, as you said, or like what can we expect as folks that manage these networks? It seems like the complexity continues to increase, and we have to expect workloads to be kind of anywhere. Is it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think part of it is cost, but also part of it is control, and the other part would be things like latency or operations. Like the one example I would have is like these large retailers like Walmart and Target are putting in a lot of edge processing, or they have edge processing, and they that's closer to the customer, that's closer to the site. So it really doesn't make sense to run all of the processing in the public cloud when they have these these compute power at the location. But also in terms of like we're hearing more about governance and centralized control, and some of the IT and the networking folks taking back control of the infrastructure because they don't know. Amazon can be a black box, right? How are they configuring the network behind the scenes, what their data is doing, all that. So people are looking at ways they can have more of a centralized operating model to see everything.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this is really the heart of the issue as we get into kind of like solutioning But for a long time, CIOs were very comfortable kind of having the networking teams own the on-prem infrastructure, and then once an application moved into the cloud, we had a different cloud operating model. It was applied to both the applications and the networks. And as we move into multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, as kind of a default operational paradigm, we have kind of these two teams figuring out how we can work in concert to support our application owners. And there's the complexity that's being kind of inflicted on the networking teams is demanding we look at how we operate, and looking at the cloud operating model. And most CIOs we speak with talk about how they want to apply more of that operating model into their data centers, and into their owned infrastructure. So application teams don't really have to concern themselves of where their application's running. They would like to have self-serve and a lot of the things we've gotten accustomed to in the cloud.
Absolutely.
So kind of moving into this, I did fail to say at the beginning, we can see questions. So if anybody has any questions, please type them in as we go. It'd be awesome to kind of include it in the discussion rather than doing Q&A at the end. So I'd appreciate it. Anybody that wants to pop a question in there, we'll integrate it in the discussion. So I think with that context, it's very helpful to understand where the market is, and how executives are looking at this complex infrastructure. If I take a step back and look at how we operate networks today, we took kind of the typical DevOps paradigm here, and tried to apply how we operate networks. So it's always strange to know where to start here, but I'll start in the plan. If we think about how we operate networks today, a lot of it is very human operations driven. It's hopefully very ticket driven. So having tickets being created, approved, deciding what changes we're going to make. So I have to develop that CLI. I might do it by hand. I might put it in a script. I'm definitely going to test it in a lab. Most likely I have some sort of MOP approval process, change management board, to make sure that what I'm going to do is known. And if any concerns are raised due to conflict or other teams, we take that into consideration. After we've tested in the lab, we release it. It's provided to an engineer to run in production. There's usually a maintenance window involved, and we do it, between 12 and 4 a.m., like we always love to do. And then we basically wait for alarms and we start the process all over. So, I think this is a very tried and true paradigm for how we make changes in the network today. Some new tools are not CLI driven, so it might be GUI based. But whether it's a firewall rule, DNS, port turnup, software upgrade, typical changes in network infrastructure, this is kind of how we look at it historically for on-prem infrastructure. And the purpose of today's call is to talk a little about shifting left. And the reason I think this is a good topic is that when we talk to folks that are not doing infrastructure as code and not adopting a kind of a cloud operating model, the initial concern is that doing infrastructure as code will be riskier. Most people assume infrastructure as code means putting your configs in Git, and having a pipeline push those changes out to the network. And while those can definitely be important aspects of infrastructure as code, the idea is to really move the testing paradigm left. And that means doing testing at the beginning. So instead of waiting to do testing in the lab or waiting to do testing as a pre-check or a post-check during a maintenance window, the real question is, how do I move testing kind of earlier in my thought process, earlier in how we operate? So, and this is how we think about maybe a more modern version of thinking of those same activities that we showed from NetOps. And I think generally in the market, from talking about adopting DevOps principles towards networking, we're starting to see a net DevOps, phrase. I mean, Scott, when you're talking with other prospects, vendors, market participants, are people starting to use net DevOps? I know we have the net sec DevOps. People like to mash these words together, but how much of the net DevOps kind of terminology comes up, or is it more focused on infrastructure as code as a paradigm?
That's a good question. You talk about taxonomies, right? When I Google things around, I would say infrastructure as code is is more widely accepted, but net DevOps, I'm seeing it more often, especially with things like monitoring. And I know you guys are working with some monitoring vendors. The integration of modern monitoring with network orchestration and automation. I think that's a we're seeing more of that, and we're seeing more people refer to it as net DevOps.
Nice. So if I look at kind of more net DevOps aspects of taking that same process, you know, ticketing systems can still be kind of a core aspect of this, but we really think about turning what we're doing in a mop into software. So when I talk about a mop, it's generally a Word document or some other script that basically tells me the activities that I need to do during the maintenance window. When we start taking human-driven changes and start to turn them into machine-driven outcomes, it's really about encoding those changes in software. And like I was saying about kind of the mental model here is that we want to do the testing before we do the release. I think historically, Itential's talked about compliance management and running compliance reports as a post-mortem. So those changes that I made into the network, I might run a compliance report the next day to find out what's changed in the network from before. I might have to send out a spreadsheet for people to resolve. But now if we encode these changes, I can have a proposed change for the network and I can actually validate it against my compliance ahead of time. So in this build and test phase, instead of running pre-checks in production that, maybe I'm a human and I have an hour and a half to run my pre-checks or an hour and a half to run my post-checks, a machine can run hundreds of tests. And the idea is that once I find an issue, maybe it's an interface description standard, maybe there's an endpoint I never want to show up in an ACL, I can add that to my regression test suite. And we will run that against every change that ever happens to the network, rather than relying on what can be done during a maintenance window. So I think if there's a handful of things to take away from kind of the concept of shift left is that adopting these principles is far more like we're going to be way safer looking at it this way. And the mental model shift from infrastructure as code maybe being complicated, maybe being an aggressive form of automation. Looking at it as how do I have a batch of tests that I can run for every change in the network to make sure that as I learn from something that went wrong, I can add it. I can add it and forever know that won't happen again because I'm going to test it before it makes it into production. So another thing we really focus on is how do we promote these automations into production. So using branching strategies and other things, I can basically make changes to my operational process in code. I can release that into a production facility. I can test it like we talked about. And then as we promote it, it's available as an API request. So we do believe that this is a precursor before we can start doing network as a service, before we can have kind of application owners making direct requests of the network. Going from a very human-centric, ticket-driven human model where I have to open up a ticket and wait some number of days. Once we start to encode this stuff, now we can have this as real-time availability for our application teams, or driven directly from ticketing teams.
Chris, I got a question for you. Is this one of the real
Shoot.
benefits of this is to take away a maintenance window that you talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have lived in a world where we, myself, we think about what I can do to the network based upon the number of maintenance windows and the number of hours. A number of customers have basically said they have more changes they need to make than they have maintenance windows in the year. And the first thought is let's script it so I can go faster. But it's a bit of a paradigm shift to actually thinking of changing how we operate. And I think it's super interesting around kind of thinking of the cloud operating model and infrastructure as code as a way to change how we operate versus just trying to speed up what we do. Because speeding up what we do, doing scripts, doing stuff, incremental, linear type of improvements, I think is interesting and necessary. But if we want to kind of take a larger leap forward, I think we're going to have to think about things differently. But a second part maybe to your question is, if I'm testing more and I'm more confident in what we're doing, can I start to operate in a 24/7 mentality, right? Do I have to make the change in the middle of the night? And I think as people start to go down this path, you see many changes start to be 24/7 activities. An easy one's always like an A record in DNS, or something like that, like and generally an add to things, not deletes, not changes, because those might be destructive. And I think it's important for customers and the market to think about taking those simple activities that are the least risky and to start to build confidence within the organization, that we can start operating in a 24/7 manner. Um, if we think about public cloud, I go into an AWS console and I make a change and it happens right then. I don't make a request and have to wait for the next day. And I think the shift and the expectations of our application owners, is such that they want that immediate feedback for things that are not destructive. So I think this is the beginning to putting the structure in place so that we are confident that we can do that.
Cool.
So I did get a question here. So we'll go live with it. So this says, does this net DevOps process imply a fully functional lab environment to allow for that testing where shifting left might be meaningful? So I think it's a good question. So um, it's our belief that the reason people don't move forward with some of these is they want to do kind of the maximum possible. So would it be awesome to have basically a replica of my network in a lab so that I could regression test every change that could ever possibly happen? I think that would be awesome. That'd be great. But I do think it's a little bit like our discussions on source of truth and data that drives automation. Automation can help us get better. I don't think we need the cleanest data with the most functional lab before we automate it. We see it a bit backwards in the sense that we have to exercise these operational models. We have to start making progress. So I would say, let's start by writing that first test. Let's write the 5th test. Let's write the 100th test. Maybe you start with things like interface descriptions have to match standards. Maybe you start with certain security policy enforcement for ACLs or otherwise, and we can make sure that those breaking changes never make their way into the network. I think in the most highly functioning organization, having a lab that meaningfully represents production, we can catch the most stuff possible. But I don't think that's a precursor to adopting these things. I think we got to start with what we can start. Because if we think about the background of why we're even doing this, and as we get into, maybe I should move forward to some of the infrastructure as code concepts, is that, and I'll just jump forward to the next slide. Why we do this is that, as networking folks and as infrastructure management teams, we are managing large, highly distributed infrastructure. And for a long time, we've built our own operating model. The reason software development has adopted these principles is because we're managing large distributed software bases, very similar to what configuration looks like on a device. I mean, a network device with 5,000 lines of config on it might as well be a repo with 5,000 lines of code on it. So we need to treat it very similarly. So the idea here is we're taking kind of the concepts of software development and applying it to infrastructure and networking kind of at its core. When we write software and we run regression testing suites, I can create a build of the software that mimics exactly what the software will be. But at the same time, as that software gets deployed, it's integrated with all sorts of other things that I can't mimic in a test bed. So I think we have to think about this similar. We want to have as much testing that represents as much of our operational model as possible. But if I'm integrating with telemetry systems and I'm integrating with testing platforms and IPAM and DNS, I might be able to stub those interfaces so I can simulate that in the lab. But in the real world, there might be certain changes in the interfaces and other things. So we want to test as much as we can. But as we get towards the end of the presentation, I mean, the most important thing is to get started. There's no doubt that there's things we can do today to get started that will put us on the path without having to think of ourselves as doing like continuous deployment in production systems, which I think is the barrier which prevents people from getting started. So maybe we
Hey,
back up, Scott, and just talk about kind of infrastructure as code adoption and kind of what you're seeing or what you're hearing from,
oh,
or if you had
sure.
if you had a question first.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have a question, but let me frame it in this slide because it's interesting. You guys asked me for data, so I looked for some data, and this slide was really interesting. Uh, Not only because of the ascending interest we see here in infrastructure as code, but there's kind of a dip or a lull there in 2021.
Yeah,
Maybe it's like the beginning of the pandemic. You see that, it kind of mimics the stock market. There's the great fear of the pandemic shutdown, and then a resurgence as everybody is like, oh, the answer is the cloud, right? Is this something that you saw? Because if you look at the bottom there in 20, it looks like 2021 to me, to more recently, it's almost doubled. The interest rapidly doubled. Are you seeing this from inquiries or people asking about using infrastructure as code and networking? Are you seeing this surge in interest?
for sure. I mean, I think in the networking space specifically, I think we're trailing a little bit of the adoption of this on the broader infrastructure kind of orchestration paradigm. So, if you talk specifically to cloud teams and we talk about cloud operating models, I think they more default to infrastructure as code as like a way, like an operational model. Um, but I think their thoughts around infrastructure as code are very basic. So I think what we can't show on this line is this is just general adoption, but um, I'm also interested in kind of the relative maturity of these concepts. Because just storing the configs in a Git repo and running a pipeline with regression testing, that's kind of table stakes for infrastructure as code. But how many people are starting to put APIs for application developers to drive changes directly in infrastructure as kind of more of an aggressive one? So I think something we're going to have to pay attention to over the next couple years here is that I think it is becoming table stakes to start on this journey. But I think within organizations, it's highly distributed. You might have one team that's being very aggressive because the types of infrastructure that they're managing maybe is less risky, and then core networking and some DCI interconnect and some other infrastructure that's maybe viewed as a higher risk item, or maybe taking a more procedural process. But as far as inquiries and customer interest and talking with the market, um, I would say 2 years ago this was not brought up at all, and I would say it's a part of a majority of our conversations today. At
Okay,
least,
interesting.
yeah,
So it does reflect this chart almost exactly then.
for sure.
Excellent. Thank you.
So, and you spend a lot of time with other network as a service vendors, multi hybrid cloud folks. What do they talk about as far as how to operate their infrastructure? Because the more modern networking vendors provide more robust APIs. Um, their operational paradigm is a lot of times more modern, I guess I would say. So, do you hear, like, as you talk to other vendors, how do they talk about how people should operate their technology? Like, how do they talk about that?
Okay, interesting question. Yeah. Well, we went through. You talked about Futuriom 50, so we just looked at these 50 companies, which meant we really looked at 100 companies, right? And the new networking companies, you call it the next generation, if you will. It's really they're almost all as a service companies. So they're all really their service is running on cloud infrastructure, either in public cloud or cloud infrastructure that they own, and it's all based on software as a service model with APIs, right? Um, and that's if you think about it, that's a fundamental shift from the traditional networking vendors who still in terms of boxes. Where do I put the box and how do I provision the box, right? So I think that's definitely a fundamental shift, whether it's an API first service, or whether it's something that's CLI first. I don't is You're more of a technology expert than I am, but that's kind of the you talked about mental models. That's kind of the mental model I think about. Is this company presenting it as a service in the cloud that you provision with APIs, or they just selling a piece of hardware with a CLI?
Yeah, and I think some of the challenge for us automating this infrastructure is the vendors you cover and some of the more modern stack. We love it because it's API first. It's a natural integration with the platform, but the volatility that exists within those APIs because they're so new, is a challenge for folks when we think about EVPNs in the data center, and cross fabrics have been fairly standardized for a number of years, and now we're doing this network as a service hybrid multi-cloud, and like AWS reInvent, like how many new services and updates to services does AWS present every year? I saw a chart one time, it's like way off high to the right. So the volatility in the infrastructure that we have to automate almost necessitates that we think about taking it, if we're going to take advantage of these new services fully, and the volatility within their APIs, we have to think about how we operate these networks differently than we've done historically, for sure.
Interesting.
So if we think about getting started, if I didn't say it before, I'll say it now. The concern when we're speaking with folks and we think about getting started is, I think the mental model around infrastructure as code is the slide I had up before, which is I need sources of truth for everything. I need all of my configs in a Git repo. I need a lab to do full regression testing. And every time I merge a change into a pipeline, it's going to immediately push to production. And I would say that mental model comes from software developers, where that is the most aggressive form of software development we have today. And if we apply software principles to networking and how we operate networks, that's one way of thinking about it. But if we think about getting started like we did with software development when we first were adopting these principles maybe 10, 15 years ago, it's really about writing your first test, writing your 10th test, writing your 100th test, and making sure we catch software defects before they're promoted and end users are using the software. So we really think about kind of 3 phases of adopting infrastructure as code for networking, and how net DevOps teams think about this. So the first step is really adopting automation. If we think about that DevOps image from before, we can't integrate human maintenance window mop processes into a pipeline, or any sort of mental infrastructure as code concept. The first thing we need to do is we need to take our human-centric NetOps model and automate it, whether that's scripts or any sort of more aggressive form of automation. The second step is really, how do I integrate automation into larger pipelines? How application teams and how line of business owners make changes to software and infrastructure is going to be largely driven from pipelines. We've seen massive movement. Scott, you've seen massive movement in the market around some of the largest vendors that own pipelines and how they're building entire suites around software development lifecycle. So we need to be able to integrate our automation with those pipelines as the de facto way that software gets updated. And then ultimately we can start to decompose our automation into smaller bite-sized pieces so we can orchestrate it more fully. And I'll maybe get into just a little bit more detail on this. So as our customers start to adopt automation, this is really the precursor. So when we're talking about infrastructure as code, for some customers, it's aspirational. For others, they're doing it today. But the first step for Itential customers is to really think about automation. And if we think about some of these individual boxes on the screen, and I'll try not to go through each one individually, but you'll see I need to integrate with other systems. I need to collect some data, source of truth data. I probably want to make sure that the configuration of the device is the way I think it is. I'm going to do some pre-checks or do some health checks. I'm going to actually make a change eventually to the network, assuming all those checks and testing were successful. Make a handful of changes, and then notify everybody that it's been complete. So this is taking my NetOps process and encoding it in automation. Here we're using some DevOps processes to talk to CLI, as Scott referenced, and we're also using some adapters to talk to more API systems. So this is really regardless of the type of infrastructure we're working with, and this could be just as easily be an AWS VPC, Transit Gateway, one of the NAS vendors that Scott was referencing. And once we build this automation, as we kind of talk to, we can start to talk to pipelines. In this example, we're just using a GitLab pipeline. I think most folks are comfortable talking about, ticketing systems being northbound. And there's all sorts of human-driven automation in a ticketing system that can't be encoded. So maybe people need to order laptops. Maybe people need to do all sorts of things. So we always assume there's some kind of greater orchestration happening across IT and infrastructure. And in this case, we're going to take a GitLab pipeline, which is taking a few steps in building this connectivity. In this case, it's an application who's actually deploying, and that application wants to make some change to the infrastructure. I think the DMARC a lot of times, as we talk about, is kind of the service mesh, and northbound is probably the application piece, and southbound of that would be the infrastructure. So in this case, GitLab pipeline is making a change to an application, and it basically is calling this automation. And this is kind of the middle ground where we're taking our automation strategy and integrating it with our application deployment or pipeline strategy. And I think this is probably the most dominant way we see people adopting some of these today. Is like we're dipping our toe in the water, we're exposing networking concepts as APIs, and the application teams can call those APIs. And so this is like giving end users real-time access to infrastructure to make changes. And then if we decide to take this automation that we've talked about and decompose it into its pieces, this is where we start to be able to build larger breakdowns of what we're doing. So this is actually allowing the pipeline to take more responsibility for the orchestration. So in the previous diagram, the automation system was saying, I'm going to do a pre-check, I'm going to do a post-check, I'm going to call up network test infrastructure, I'm going to go get infrastructure, I'm going to go get an IP address, I perform changes and do notifications. Sometimes pipelines want to run, like we said, tens, hundreds, or thousands of tests. So if we're doing golden config, or if we build a pre-check or a post-check, we can actually make those individual API calls. So this is really decomposing our automation into individual components to allow the orchestration system and the pipeline to call these things individually. So this is where we're actually offering up, networking and testing and validation as a service to the larger orchestrated system, so that we can have these teams more aggressively integrated and more detailed working together. If I think about some of the changes I might make in software, I might string all my activities together, but I might also want to run a test framework independent from my pipeline, and this allows that to happen. So we really see people getting started from an automation standpoint, integrating the systems kind of at a high level, Scott, and then ultimately breaking down our automation so that we can move some of the orchestration logic from the automation system into the pipeline, so that the application teams can have more control over how they consume this infrastructure.
Cool. I got a question on this, if you don't mind.
Please.
So it looks like you're really leveraging GitLab here in this model. Is that one of the more dominant? What do you call these? The infrastructure is code Git repositories. I mean, we know we have GitHub, and now we have GitLab, and I'd like to know: is this going to become like a new kind of quasi duopoly? Like the public clouds.
So yeah, so you have like Bitbucket, which was bought by Atlassian. So you have an Atlassian, and then you have GitHub, which was going strong. Microsoft took out, and now GitLab is we see these as the dominant customers for these ecosystem is software developers. So they build ecosystems for software developers to build software, deploy software, test software. And this is why we get excited. I think we have a long history in the networking space of trying to build, I don't know, special tools for our stuff, and adopting principles and tooling that are used by millions of software developers every day. We get to kind of ride shotgun and take advantage of the complexity that they've already removed from this. So, automating network infrastructure and cloud infrastructure, GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, they don't know anything about that. They understand how to run pipelines, they understand how to build software, and they know how to deploy things. But ultimately, those services rely on domain specific technologies, even to deploy software, containers, etc. So yeah, you've definitely seen maybe 3 vendors separate themselves from the pack, but I think there's probably a whole lot of vendors that would jump up and down and say they're hot on the path to try to create an alternative. But you've seen a big rush of investment by those 3 kind of larger shops to build out a full portfolio. If you went back maybe 4 or 5 years and you talked to a software developer, they had to piecemeal it together. So I might use a Git repo from here, I might use a test framework from there, I might use a third party thing. So like other types of vendors you would see is like Jenkins for pipelines. You would see Circle CI. But those are like pipeline companies, whereas there's entire ecosystems. So the GitLab, GitHub are building more kind of entire software development ecosystems. They've bought a bunch of people, built a bunch of stuff. But the important thing for this is that we're taking network and infrastructure orchestration and plugging it into what has traditionally been a software development process.
I see.
And instead of starting from scratch, we get to this is a 15-year mature ecosystem that we get to plug into and take advantage of. And I think that's a pattern we need to follow. Is we're moving from manually making changes on a CLI to managing millions of lines of config across distributed systems and a hybrid cloud management. And when you stare at the problem long enough, you realize that we have to have a different way of operating this. And instead of us inventing a new way, we just need to look as a metaphor to other industries to say, how is this type of challenge tackled by others? And I think that's why infrastructure as code is really taken off. It's a close enough metaphor for what we do that we can really take advantage of it and really accelerate how we manage infrastructure.
Okay, very cool.
So if there's any other questions, I'd ask you to put them in the question board here. Yeah, I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground today, Scott. I don't know if there's anything that jumps out from our previous discussions, but I mean, from looking at your research, the fact that hybrid is default. I mean, I think we used to joke, I think AWS didn't even allow multi or hybrid at reInvent until maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So there was still a fight over kind of a single public cloud. And I think people started talking about multiple clouds, because one department would pick Azure and one department would pick AWS, and then we were kind of multi-cloud. It didn't mean we necessarily had to integrate those clouds because it was 2 separate applications. But as everything becomes a service, I think most enterprises find themselves across many clouds, and it's our challenge to connect these things in a controlled manner and provide APIs back to these teams. So it's I think from all research and all my conversations, it seems like this is what people are thinking about on a daily basis.
100%. And one thing I think I may not have emphasized appropriately earlier is that one of the things that we're seeing and hearing is about a shift back towards the networking folks as kind of leading this multi-cloud hybrid cloud transition. And I'm talking about in real life. I'm not talking about in the analyst's ivory tower where we just look at data. I'm talking about talking to CIOs who have to bring the networking departments together with the DevOps and with the developers that you talked about to enable this hybrid cloud infrastructure, because the bottom line is everything has to be connected with a network, right? So I'm assuming we have a predominance of networking people on this call, but hey, you folks are in charge now. Isn't that great? Maybe you can get a pay raise too.
No, I think it's a great way to end it. And I want to thank everybody for joining. Scott, thanks for all the research and participating today, and look forward to future discussions.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks everybody for joining.